This is Demel Gonzalez of Heartwood Financial Services. Hey, thanks for joining me for our video here on financial education. Now, the topic that we've been working on for 2 months now, this is part 2 on retirement income planning. So the first one you should definitely check out. We got into some of the risks that are out there in retirement income planning, highlighting the sequence of returns risk. If you don't know what that is, definitely go back and check out the video. It lays the groundwork for this one, where we get into different retirement income strategies. I hope you guys enjoy. All right, let's get things started with the sequence of returns risk recap. If you remember the story of Laura and Lou and Helen and Henry here, they both had $1 million. They were taking out $50,000 out of their account, which is a 5% withdrawal rate. And they had the same returns, just in the reversed order, okay? And so this is what that sequence of returns risk is that when you're making withdrawals out of the account, it could dramatically give you different results depending on when those returns happen. And as you can see on here, that the risk is usually at the beginning. If you have some bad years at the beginning, it can set you back and put you in a little bit of a hole, where if you get good returns at the beginning, it can give you a cushion and give you a nice buffer for many years to come. So what we're going to talk about here are the different retirement income strategies to help address this risk. So as we get started here, I want to set the foundation for what makes a great income plan. I've talked to lots of retirees, pre-retirees over the years, and I have come up with 3 basic things that most retirees are looking for when they're creating an income plan. So number 1, they're looking for predictable income, right? Now that you don't have a job anymore, you want your money to be your job. And you never liked it when your boss would change your pay. You know, you want your pay to be as predictable as possible. Obviously, things happen. But if we can have that income be nice and steady over time, that would definitely make it a great part of your income plan. The other part that we need is we need growth. Because as you know, especially nowadays with inflation the way it is, we need to make sure that we have more money in the future so that we can give ourselves a raise from time to time, because things just, they get more expensive over time. So we need that growth. And if inflation is 3 or 4%, that means we need to have some growth on top of the income that we're generating. All right? And then the last thing I would say is flexibility. Flexibility is very important because the markets change. Your situation changes. So if you lock yourself into a strategy that is very rigid, you may have a hard time adapting or transitioning into something new. So when designing a great retirement income plan, you want to have all 3 of these elements. And as I talk about these different strategies, I'm going to show you how these 3 elements rank in the plan. All right? All right, let's start with the interest-only strategy. This is kind of like the classic strategy that probably mom and dad did when they retired, right? You would just buy enough fixed income investments to get enough income that you need to take care of your income needs. Now, the challenge with this is that we need 5% in this example. And I don't know if you realize this, but it's actually very challenging right now to find bonds or stock dividends that pay a 5% yield. In today's environment right now, the 10-year treasury pays about 3%. So it's a very challenging thing to do. And even if you could, you'd be loading up on things that maybe have very long maturities, or if you use stocks, you'd probably be narrowing into very specific sectors and not be very well diversified. Now, of course, you can also look at annuities, and annuities, depending on your age, can pay you a healthier income because they're paying you interest plus your principal, okay? But the problem with doing that is that 5% withdrawal rate would require you to pretty much put all of your money into the annuity. And you probably know that income annuities are not very liquid. So that means that you would have to put all of your money, and it would basically be not easily accessible to you. So this interest-only strategy really only works if you have a much lower withdrawal rate at the moment. All right, quick recap on the interest-only strategy and how it does with the 3 elements of a great retirement income plan. So we have predictable income. The interest-only strategy does pretty good with that. The bonds, especially if they're individual bonds, individual stocks, and they can fluctuate a little bit, but not too much. If you use a immediate income annuity, that is usually a pretty predictable thing. It's it's going to have that income for life or for the term, and so ranks pretty good on predictable income. On the growth side of it, this is probably where it lacks the most. It's, again, very capital intensive, so you don't have much money left over for growth, and bonds aren't very good for growth. The stocks could give you a little bit of growth, but usually if you're getting these high dividends, they usually don't grow that much. You can look at a lot of these high dividend stocks like Verizon and AT&T, for example. And then if you use an annuity, now if the annuity pays you a little bit more than 5%, you might be able to have a little bit of money for growth, but it probably wouldn't be very much, and it definitely wouldn't be enough to keep up with inflation, especially nowadays. So this one doesn't do very good in the growth category. And in the flexibility, individual bonds are a little bit of a pain to sell. You can sell them, but usually you get kind of a haircut with them. The stocks are pretty easy to sell. An immediate income annuity is usually not even available to sell. Some you can, but very difficult to do so. So this ranks kind of low on the flexibility, very low on the growth, but very good on the predictable income. All right, and the second strategy is called the systematic withdrawal plan. Now, this is the strategy that a lot of people end up using by default. They didn't even realize that this is what they're doing. So you basically have a portfolio, right, that you've been saving up for many, many years. You've been buying stocks and bonds and maybe have some cash. And then you decide you want to retire. And you don't really change anything. You just kind of have the same thing. Instead, you just start making withdrawals out of the account and you just take it out proportionally. There's not necessarily a strategy of where you pull it from. You're just taking it out proportionally, either every month or every year or something like that. And so that's why I have this piggy bank here with the spigot on it, because you're essentially taking it out pro rata. That is a systematic withdrawal strategy. Okay, so let's take a look at the systematic withdrawal plan and do a quick recap on how it does with those 3 elements of a great financial plan. So predictable income, number 1, how does it do? Mediocre, not great. The portfolio that has stocks and bonds and even a little bit of cash will still fluctuate quite a bit. Your income that you can withdraw from it can be a regular amount, but the underlying principal can vary a lot, and it could run into that sequence of return risk that we talked about, right? So that one is a little bit mediocre. Number 2, you can have great growth potential, especially if you're using some portion of stocks in the portfolio, and so you have a lot of good growth potential. Flexibility is very, very good there as well. Usually bond funds and stock funds, ETFs, those types of things are very easy to sell and liquidate. Now, if you're using some sort of annuity, let's say you go with a variable type of annuity instead of a fixed type of annuity, they have maybe a little bit more flexibility, but usually there's surrender charges and things involved that will make it a little bit less accessible, especially if you have an emergency and you need the money right away. So I would say that if you use the annuity, a little bit less flexible, but if you don't, it has a lot more flexibility. And then we have the third strategy called the bucket strategy. This strategy really tries to take advantage of some behavioral finance stuff that goes on in our brains where we like to be able to compartmentalize things. So that's essentially what we're doing here. So it works like this. Bucket number one, usually you put your money that you're going to need in the first year in retirement. And you're going to put it into the most liquid, most conservative things like your checking account, savings, maybe even a money market account. Typically at least a year's worth of cash. And then bucket number two, we carve out usually 3 or 5, sometimes even as much as 10 years of that income that you're going to need every year. You put it in bucket number two and we invest it. Now, we don't need it every day, so we can actually invest it and get a little bit more interest than just in those money markets, but we don't want to be too aggressive because we don't want to deal with that sequence of return risk, remember? So we invest it very conservatively, mostly bond funds, maybe a little bit in stocks and some different things. And we would carve that money out to give us time for bucket number three. You see, bucket number three is the one that's going to be the most aggressive. It's going to be invested in mostly equity-based types of investments to give you the most growth. And the hard thing about those types of investments is that they can fluctuate a lot, right? I don't need to tell you, we've seen the market here recently. So it's nice to have bucket number 1 and 2 to give bucket number 3 time. And then once bucket number 1 and bucket number 2 have been depleted, then we refill the buckets number 1 and number 2. And what's really cool is if we have really great markets before bucket number 2 is empty, we can top it off. So that's kind of nice. And if bucket number 3 doesn't do well for a while, we don't have to top it off. But hopefully sometime within the 3 or the 5 or the 10, whatever amount you use for bucket number 2 will give us enough time to let bucket number 3 to replace what you spent and hopefully even get us a little bit more growth on top of that. So, quick bucket strategy recap. How does it do in the 3 elements of a great retirement income plan? The predictability income part, well, it is a little bit better than the systematic withdrawal plan because we are carving out the money into those first and second buckets, right? And it becomes a little bit more predictable. Even though it's not a permanent solution, it's a temporary one, it does help a lot to add to predictability. So it's not perfect, but better. The second one is growth. So are we getting growth here? Yes, because we're not putting all the money in bucket number 1 and bucket number 2. We're actually using only some of it to cover part of the time. So the rest of the money can go into bucket number 3 and can grow and hopefully recuperate the money that we pulled out of bucket number 2 and bucket number 1. And with time, it has a pretty good chance of doing that. So the growth there looks pretty decent. And then number 3, flexibility. Yes, I think it's actually also pretty flexible, especially if you use mutual funds and ETFs, liquid instruments like that. If you go into individual bonds, you run into the same problem with the interest-only strategy, but there's still some flexibility there. If you would use any kind of annuity with this, it also adds a little bit more complexity and a little bit less flexibility to it. But maybe a hybrid of some sort could also make sense here. But if you use a traditional mutual fund ETF strategy, you could also have a lot of flexibility. All right, thanks for tuning in and watching the video. I hope it was helpful. I just want to make sure I emphasize if you're one of those pre-retirees or retirees that are at one of those higher withdrawal rates, north of 4, going into 5, even getting close to 6% withdrawal rate, I would say, first of all, the best solution is to try to bring that down a little bit. That will increase your odds of success incredibly, even if it's just a little bit. But if you can't do that, I want to make sure you really understand that sequence of return risk and try to address it using one of those strategies that we talked about in this video. And if you need some help with that, reach out to a certified financial planner, get some help with it. They will give you some advice, accountability, and help you implement the plan. It can make a huge difference to your results, but most importantly, give you a lot more peace of mind with the whole process. Thank you, and God bless.